They're very definitive that if you put in, say, 5 hectares of catch crop, you must also have a 5-hectare layback area as well. And that layback must be grassland, and it must be available to the animals at all times. So you can't shut them in onto the catch crop and let them out onto the grassland another time. They must have access to that grassland all the time.
Reports of yields are mixed, from very disappointing to pleasantly surprised. However, the average yields across most farms are a long ways from last year's highs. Many farmers now want to forget about this year, and others are certainly thinking about next year and making plans for harvest 2024. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm delighted today to be joined again by Shay Phelan, a tillage specialist in Teagasc, to chat about some of the rule changes which may benefit farmers but also catch them out this year, and also about oilseed rape as the planting season is upon us now. Shay, straw has been baled over the last number of years, some that have been on the ground for over a month or more. However, there are a number of farmers who are deciding maybe to switch fields or change fields as part of the straw incorporation measure, the department. What are the rules that farmers need to be aware of in terms of swapping and changing fields as part of the same scheme, Shay?
It's quite simple actually, in that if they want to change from one field to the other, they can do still at this stage. But I suppose crucially that the fields that they swap must be at least the same size or greater than the size of the parcel that they've already submitted earlier on in the year. And I suppose the other thing just to be aware of that they won't get any more payment. So if you swap a 6-hectare field and put in a 6-hectare field now for a 5-hectare field, you can do it, but you'll only get paid for the 5 hectares that you originally claimed back in May. So they can do it, but just there's that crucial sort of a rule around it.
And on the other side of that, can a farmer, if they decide that, God, there wasn't a whole lot of straw here at all, and I need a bit more straw for myself, or to sell, if indeed, can they withdraw altogether from that same scheme at this stage?
It's my understanding they can, but there will be penalties probably on that. So whatever they withdraw, they'll lose that payment obviously on that. So yes, they can, but they just have to be careful of that, you know.
Okay. And can a farmer complete that themselves in terms of informing the department of their choice to change to different fields or to indeed withdraw? Yeah,
they can do it themselves, or they can get their agent to do it, but there's an email there that they can send in the details to. It's sim@agriculture.gov.ie. And if they email in the details to that email address, they can facilitate the change from one field to the other by doing that.
So the farmer would need to give their herd number, the fields that were submitted, and exactly the fields that they want to change to, and the reasons for doing that.
Exactly. Give all those details and they'll be able to do it then, yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, look, that makes it relatively simple for farmers to do that. I suppose the next step that a lot of farmers are already thinking about now is the straws, being gathered off the field, and they're probably thinking about the next crop, which could either be, and we'll come back to oilseed rape in a few minutes, but it could also be catch crops as well. So just in terms of the catch crops, there are a few new rules around catch crops, and some of those might catch out some farmers out there. You might maybe give us an idea about what these new rules entail.
Yeah, it's right. You're right, Michael. There are some new rules around catch crops where they're being grazed, okay? And these are covered under GAEC 6 of the conditionality that they all would have signed up to in the background when they were making their BIS applications back in April and May. So it really only concerns them if they're going to graze these. It's about preventing poaching and mining soil structure. And that's what GAEC 6 is all about. So from that point of view, the big one, I suppose, that most people have cottoned on to probably in the last couple of weeks is this whole area of a layback. So they're very definitive that if you put in, say, 5 hectares of catch crop, you must also have a 5-hectare layback area as well. And that layback must be grassland, and it must be available to the animals at all times. So you can't shut them in onto the catch crop and let them out onto the grassland another time. They must have access to that grassland.
So essentially an adjoining field, Shay.
Yes, adjoining field. It's not a field that's a kilometre away. It's an adjoining field. So they must have access to that. And I suppose that's a crucial one for most tillage farmers, because if you have a tillage farmer who's a specialist tillage farmer, most of them don't have grassland. So for those people who were taking in animals or taking in livestock over the winter months, this is certainly something that's not going to be available to them this year. The other issues that are there as well, for those that must leave a vegetative strip of at least 3 meters around external boundaries that don't touch a watercourse. So hedgerows, walls, fences, they must leave a 3 meter boundary around those. But where you have a water feature, whether that be a stream or a river or a lake or whatever it is, it must be a 4 meter strip, and that'll have to be fenced as well, obviously. So there are a number of rules regarding those catch crops that guys are thinking of putting in at the moment. So they just need to sit down and read some of those terms and conditions on conditionality. It's GAEC 6, and see how they affect them. And I suppose one of the things they should be looking at in that, and it declares it very, very well in terms of what the rules and stipulations will be. It tells the farmer actually on the booklet what a farmer will inspect for. So the farmer will inspect for, evidence that the fields have been overgrazed, that there's poaching or rutting on the fields. If they were using, say, the likes of round feeders, that they're not leaving round feeders in the same place all the time, and that they're moving them around so that they're reducing the amount of poaching around round feeders. And obviously, then they're going to look for the layback and the buffer zones. So it's something that I suppose most people, well, I won't say most people, but a lot of people were unaware of up until recently, and they certainly need to get familiar with these new rules and regulations if they're going to bring in livestock onto the farm.
And Shay, does that just extend to the cover crops, or does it extend a little bit further? It's like, say, a farmer had maybe beet tops that might have grazed in the past. Does that include that?
And to the best of my knowledge, Michael, as far as I know, it extends to the likes of beet tops as well. So if I was grazing beet tops, I would be looking at trying to make sure I have a layback area for them as well. So it's something that, again, probably has flown under the radar for a lot of people this year. There was mention of it early on in the spring, but I think the way the year has gone, everybody has kind of forgotten about some of those new rules and regulations. So again, it does mention non-forage crops, non-grass forage crops in the terms and conditions. So to my mind, that covers the likes of beet tops, kales, all those type of things.
Okay, so it's certainly a big area to watch out for there for many farmers. Just
Absolutely.
moving on a little bit then, Shay, from there, thinking about the other crops that are due to go in, I suppose, over the next couple of weeks. People are probably thinking about oilseed rape for next year. The planting period, like I say, is probably upon us, and maybe some people's decisions might be guided about how the crop performed this year. Was it reasonably good across the country, Shay?
It was mixed, I suppose, Michael, is the best way to put it. Some people got on very well and were very happy with winter oilseed rape, and some people were less so. Now, again, we have to remember back to the autumn and spring and what the weather we've had and weather conditions we had coming up to harvest as well. So, I mean, it wasn't immune to all the weather conditions that we had. Some people were doing over 2 tons an acre, 5 tons a hectare, even up to 5.5 tons a hectare. But yet there was more crops in certain areas that were doing maybe between 2.5 and 3 tons per hectare. So some people were a little bit annoyed, I suppose, with the performance of some of those poorer crops. The reason for it are probably there's probably various different reasons for it in terms of there was probably some issues, I suppose, with clubroot, which we'll come to later on, I suppose, that there was definitely issues with clubroot out there this year. There were other issues then around getting close to harvest time where maybe crops were overripe and people just didn't get to cut them on time. And, we're hearing lots of stories about stubbles being very green when people eventually got in to go and harvest them. So there was probably a bit of shatter, pod shatter, and losses at the head as well. So and as well as that, I suppose some people have mentioned to me, and some of the agronomists have mentioned to me that pod numbers weren't high in some crops, and maybe that's down to poor weather around flowering and things like that as well. So there's probably a variety of reasons why there was huge variation in the crops this year.
Okay, and it's probably it's always a good idea for any farmer to look back on their agronomic treatment of the crop through the year in terms of there's probably more use now, I think, Shay, of the likes of growth regulators now than
Yes,
maybe there was in the
yes.
past, and maybe people should be, really examining, is everything really contributing to the yield, or is it just is it contributing, or perhaps maybe even reducing it a bit? So people should really be thinking about what's out there and what they're actually after doing. In terms
Exactly.
of the varieties, Shay, they can have a bit of an influence on the overall yield, or can they, in fact? Is there much of a difference between a lot of the varieties that are available out there, and maybe is there other parameters other than yield that people should really be looking at as regards some of the key characteristics they should be picking out?
Yeah, as you say, Michael, there's a lot of factors when you go in to pick a variety, and quite often we all kind of look at the varieties and we look at the yield figures first. So we'll see what's going to give us the highest yield, highest potentially, should I say? It's not a guarantee, and we work back from that. And quite often, especially with oilseed rape, there are characteristics that we really should be looking out for. So say if we take for example the likes of light leaf spot resistance, so its ability to resist infection of light leaf spot can have a huge bearing on overall yield. And light leaf spot is one of those diseases that can certainly reduce yield very, very quickly if you get a bad infestation of it. And there are differences there between varieties in terms of how resistant they are to it. So that's probably the first one I would look at. Another agronomic trait that I would look at is pod shatter resistance. And that's certainly, maybe it's a knee-jerk reaction for this year, but certainly there seem to be a lot of losses on the head, talking to farmers and agronomists around the country. And there are a couple of varieties there, the likes of Ambassador, and that have pod shatter resistance. So that's a trait that's becoming more and more common in oilseed rape now, and it's certainly one that I think is important.
So Shay, in terms of height or standing ability, I mean, most rapes seem to stand up fairly well now. Does that make a bit of any difference, really?
Yeah, it does, and I suppose the overall plant height does make a difference, and lodging resistance. There is a score there for lodging resistance, and some of the older varieties were taller and more prone to lying over. Some of the newer varieties coming on do have better lodging resistance, likes of Ambassador. These things have high resistance to lodging, and that does help because when crops start to lean off, you do get a kink in the stem, and that does reduce the flow of nutrients up and down through the stem. So if you can prevent lodging, that does help as well.
Yeah, I've seen a number of varieties, the likes of Aurelia or Auckland or some of those kind of varieties there, and they're pretty, some of them can be tallish enough, and use of growth regulators, certainly, as we mentioned before, seems to be able to help in that. But would nitrogen be probably the more key nutrient there in terms of preventing that lodging?
Absolutely, Michael. And I guess, I'm thinking that, or talking to guys during the year, some people were able to get away with a lot less nitrogen this year than other years and other growers, and maybe that's down to just how they monitor the crop. We've always promoted the use of a green area index measure, or measuring in February, and establishing how much nitrogen is in the crop in February, and then starting to work back from that. So we've had people this year who telling me that they're growing crops for not much more than 125 or 130 kilos of nitrogen, and then you have other guys who are going up closer to 190 to 200 kilos of nitrogen. So it depends on how well they've monitored the crops. For the last couple of seasons, I think there has been opportunity to save it. There doesn't seem to be as much pigeon grazing the last couple of years. Now that could be famous last words for this year, but
We're after
they,
jinxing it now, Shay. We're after jinxing it.
it does make a difference where pigeons are not grazing, and I think that's something that people need to be more aware of. That nitrogen that's contained in those leaves, if it's in situ in the crop, you don't necessarily need all that nitrogen that's allowed to be put on, if you like, on the nitrates regulation. So
And
there are savings to be
I
made there.
suppose, Shay, that circles back around to the overall planting date.
Yes.
If does it matter if people slide into September, or should they be trying to plant it really in the next couple of weeks?
I'm always one of those who would like to get it in August if I can at all. I mean, we've all had experiences of sowing oilseed rape into the middle of September. Sometimes it works. Sometimes, you start to see more problems with grazing and pests and what have you. So from my point of view, I always like to get it in August if I can at all, especially the further north in the country you go. Down south, I suppose, if you're down on Cork or Wexford, you do have that little bit more flexibility that you can go into into September. But certainly for me, I'd like to have it all starting probably the end of this week or early next week. Like to have it all in by the end of August.
What sort of consideration, Shay, would you give this year in comparison to the last number of years in terms of the soil condition out there at the moment? I mean, last year was extremely dry. This year we're off the back of probably the wettest July on record. Soils are at that the water moisture holding capacity. I mean, they're pretty much full of water, and they're actually can be wet enough out there. Do you think that will influence people's decision in terms of going earlier rather than later?
Yeah, it certainly is a consideration, Michael. And one of the things that people should be really looking at with those soil conditions is that you do need to go into a good seed bed. So if you have issues like compaction, like we're seeing this year, probably for the first time in a few years, whereby there's soil on the roads after people take out crops of wheat or barley. So there's definitely soil compaction issues there. Maybe surface compaction might be down too deep, but nonetheless, there's probably some there. And so those type of soils, if there is compaction, oilseed rape does not like compaction. So you don't get that root penetration, you don't get the anchorage in the ground, and you can get lodging afterwards and poor uptake of nutrients. So in those situations, especially where people are looking at reduced cultivation establishment methods, whether that be, just a straight min-till or direct drill, or some people use a subsoiler type machine to put it in, they certainly need to be looking at the soil conditions and compaction, if there is any there, and relieving that before they start drilling.
I suppose the other side of it is that soils are a little bit wet. If you get an awful lot of heavy rain, maybe over the next week, you'd probably be excluded from the field very quickly, I'd say, given the conditions that are there.
You will, of course, yeah.
Go back to the varieties and circling back to those for a second, Shay. There is, you mentioned some of the straightforward varieties. Most of them are hybrids. Yeah, I suppose with lots of those stacked variety characteristics in them, the likes of pod shatter and light leaf spot resistance and lodging and that kind of stuff involved in it. But then you have other varieties out there. You have the likes of Clearfield varieties. What does that bring to the party?
They've kind of got a niche market, if you like, Michael. And Clearfield basically are varieties, they're hybrid varieties whereby you can use a herbicide on them, which will kill out the likes of brassica weeds. So if you go on your normal varieties, like when we're talking about likes of Ambassador Aurelia, there's little or no control of brassica weeds, likes of charlock, the likes of hedge mustard, runch, those type of weeds. There's no control, no herbicide control for any of those weeds in those crops. But the likes of Clearfield varieties, they do give you the opportunity to sow into those fields whereby you might have a heavy infestation of, the likes of a charlock or other even forage brassicas that are coming through, and we see those as well. So it does give you that opportunity to sow into those fields. I suppose the downside of it is those varieties tend to be a little bit behind in terms of overall yield. So you're looking at maybe a 5 or a 10% decrease in yield for those varieties. But that said, if you were to sow ordinary or normal sort of varieties into those fields, the losses could be a lot higher from the point of view of competition from those weeds. So they do offer growers that opportunity to spread the area where they can actually put oilseed rape into.
So the special part about those then, Shay, is the weed control, but it's down to the herbicide that's used with that. What's the special herbicide that needs to be used specifically with Clearfield varieties?
So Michael, on that you have a herbicide there called Clearanda, which can only be used on hybrid varieties. Okay, so and I suppose that's the thing to be careful of with this. If you put Clearanda plus the dash that normally goes with it, if you put that onto your normal varieties, it will kill them. So we've had a couple of cases like this before, whereby people have called us out and they've put on Clearanda onto a crop, and suddenly they're telling us some of the crop are dying. And what is happening there is maybe volunteers from a previous crop have grown up, and those are dying. But after a while, eventually you see the Clearfield varieties, which are designated with a CL on the bag. You'll know then that you have a Clearfield variety, and you see those Clearfield varieties coming through afterwards. So it's just something to be careful.
Is that a pre or post emerge application?
Can be pre or post. So most of it is applied post emergence from kind of expanded cotyledons up to about 9 true leaves.
Okay. The other issue we mentioned earlier in terms of oilseed rape is clubroot, and there was a lot of clubroot, certainly a lot more clubroot turned up over the last year or so than we've seen for an awful long time. In terms of clubroot, my understanding of it is that it's once it's in a field, it's in a field, and it's going to be there for 20 years or more in terms of the spores. And anytime you put a normal brassica into it, whether that's a cover crop you mentioned before, such as the forage rapes or stubble turnips or any of those kind of things, and indeed oilseed rape as well, the club root's going to come into it. Is there anything, if a farmer has suspects or probably maybe has identified clubroot in their land, and but that being said, they really want to go with oilseed rape for that particular slot, is there any varieties out there that can help out in that?
There are, Michael. There are a couple of hybrid, or a couple of or clubroot tolerant, I suppose, varieties out there. I won't say resistant, I would say tolerant. So certainly have to talk to their local merchants and see what's available. In different areas, there's different varieties. So they just need to talk to whatever merchant there are in their areas and see what's there. There are some, but they're not that common. But look, if they go talk to the local merchants, they should see what's there.
Crocodile and Chrome, I think, were ones that I stumbled upon there the other day. And what are the yields of those like? Or I know they're being they probably you have to go to the UK for that, but how did this stack up in the UK in terms of those yields?
Again, you're talking, Michael, there is a yield penalty on those, so you're talking a 5 or a 10% yield penalty on those. So you just have to bear that in mind, that they don't yield as well as other varieties. So you do pay that yield penalty. Like any of those hybrids coming through, it takes a couple of years for them to get yield comparable to your conventional varieties.
So I suppose look up if you're intending to, and look up the AHDB guide there. There's a few of them trialed there over a number of years. And like I said, the two that kind of comes to my mind at least anyway is Chrome and Crocodile, and there's another one.
Yeah, and there's a couple of others as well out there that some of the other
ones as well. Yeah,
as well have
okay.
as well.
Shay, the very last question I'm going to ask you then is around the general weed control in rape, in terms of should growers be going pre-emerge or can they wait a little bit to post-emerge? And is there an ideal option for farmers, or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
I would always be in favour, Michael, of going pre-emergence if I can at all. Now that comes with a couple of caveats. Number one is, I suppose, that you get in to do it in the first place, but you also need to know the weed spectrum of the field that you're going into, because I mean the herbicides that are available there's quite a few of them, but there are gaps in all of them. So from that point of view, if you're going into a field and you know nothing about it, more and more people in that scenario are tending to leave it until post-emergence and see what they have and working away on that. But certainly, I on land that you're familiar with and that there's where the weed spectrum is, I'm inclined to go with pre-emergence. And I suppose if you look at some trial work from the UK, they can show you that it's likes of volunteer cereals, for example, which are we all know going to come up in it. They can compete very well with oilseed rape and can reduce yield. A 20 cereal per square meter population of cereals in an oilseed rape crop can knock it by about 0.15 a ton per hectare. So, and there are other trials showing that broadleaf weeds can knock yield by between 5 and 8% as well. So, letting those weeds grow unchecked or uncontrolled until you come in later in the season. Quite often, people use the likes of an astrocarb or something like that in December and January. But quite often, some of the target weeds can be very, very strong by the time you get to do that. So I always kind of prefer, if I can at all, to get in with something like Catamaran Turbo pre-emergence. It can be, some people say it's quite expensive, but look at if it controls the weeds that you want to control, likes of cleavers, fat hen, poppy, sow thistles, things like that. I think then it's good practice to get in and get those done early. You can always come back in and tidy up some of the grass weeds or the volunteer cereals then post emergence as well. So I always try to get in, if I can. I try and get in as soon after drilling as I possibly can. Now, in some cases that's possible, in some isn't. But there are options there, the likes of Butacin, the likes of that as well, which can be used as well. Or Rapsan, there's pretty much the same stuff. So there are options there.
That's go pretty much. Yeah. Okay. And I suppose, Shay, just I'll finish up on this one. I suppose it has been a very wet July. There's probably a lot of slugs around. Keep an eye out on the early stages in oilseed rape in terms of slugs and the damage they can do kind of early on. So Shay, listen, I'm going to hold it up there, and listen, thanks very much for your time. Delighted you could join us again, and thanks for all that information. Thank you.
No problem, Michael. Thanks a million.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Shay for joining me on the show. Just to remind you, a date for your diary is again on Friday, September the 8th, when we will have the Crops Forum in the Kilashee Hotel in Naas. We will cover a number of topics this year, including new varieties, agronomy for the autumn, the new MAC or climate change model for tillage, and also a discussion forum with the stakeholders around the future of the tillage industry. So finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.